guys, so I've been getting a lot of questions on how to dissect a passage and kind of what are some tips for doing that. So today we're going to be going over Mark 6 verses 30 to 44, and this is the part where Jesus is feeding the 5,000. So one of the first things I want to tell you is that you want to view everything in light of context. So since this is right in the middle of Mark 6, what I want you to do is go ahead before you start dissecting this portion is to read the beginning of Mark chapter 6. So start with verse 1, go all the way down until until verse 56, which is the end of chapter 6. This is going to give you a little more context as to what's going on, because a lot of times things that are in the passage you're studying will relate to a previous passage or will then connect to the next passage. So you want to make sure that you've got a good picture of what's going on. The biggest thing that I could tell you is context is everything. So if you don't have context to the passage, it's hard to understand what is actually going on. So first, start with context and then begin to break it down. After you've read context, which we're talking about the previous verses and the ones following, then you want to read the section as a whole. So don't just start at the beginning and then go verse by verse. Read that whole passage. So you're going to read verse 30 to 44 in Mark 6. This is going to give you the big picture. Now, when you have a big picture, it's a little bit easier to pull certain things out because you understand what's going on. So remember, context first and then go through each one because this is going to give you the big picture. So let's go ahead. We're going to start at the feeding of the 5,000. Now, one of the resources I use when I study the Gospels is I use a synoptic gospel. Now, synoptic gospel is when they have all four Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, laid out side by side in regards to the stories. So this helps if you want to pick out things that are different and unique to each passage. This is going to show you how to do that. Now, you don't have to have one of those. I like it because it makes it a little bit more easier and convenient when I'm studying a passage. But another way is you can look up, and I'll provide you with the passages, but you can look up and see what are the verses in the passages for each gospel. Now, different passages may not be in every gospel, but the feeding of the 5,000 is. So one thing I'm going to write is that Mark is one of the longer accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. So I'm going to write that on the side. Mark is the longest account of the feeding of the 5,000. Now this is going to kind of help me a little bit when I go to other passages. Once I know what this passage says, I can connect it. So I'm going to box this off. Just like that. The purpose of boxing off is that way the more you have, the harder it's going to be to read what goes with what. So let's make this one green, and I'm going to highlight this top up here where it says the feeding of the 5,000. I'm going to highlight this. Perfect. Okay, then I'm going to come over and highlight my box. I'm just going to highlight right over the top of it. Perfect. Do the same thing. Now I'm going to draw a connecting line. So we're going to go and just kind of draw a line. It's okay if it goes through the verses because you're just going to have a ton of lines going on. Now, one thing you want to do is now highlight your connecting line. The more lines you get, the harder it's going to be to understand what goes with what as you continue down the page. So just start by highlighting this verse right here. You're going to highlight the line, and then you'll be able to track it. Now, there's 3 other accounts besides Mark's of the feeding of the 5,000. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write that on top. The very top of the Bible, there's a little bit of space in my journaling Bible. I'm going to write that right on top. So the ones that have the same passage are, let's see, it's going to be Matthew. And let's go ahead and turn over there so you can see it. But it's Matthew, let me find it. I think it's Matthew 14. Okay, it's Matthew 14, 13 through 21. So Matthew 14, 13 through 21. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go over here. I'm going to write that at the top. Matthew 14, 13 to 21. Now that I know that that's a connecting passage, when I'm done doing my study, I can pull out some things that are different. So I'm going to come over here. I've already got some notes based on earlier study I did with this. But now I can come over and I can pull out things that are different in relation to the same passage I'm going through in Mark. Okay, so then the next one is in Luke, and it's Luke 9, 10 through 17, and then the final one is John 6, 1 through 13. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, box it off. It's okay if you have to kind of make your boxes funky. It'll all relate. Okay, and because I'm still connected to this, I'm going to do it all in the same color. So I'm going to take my green and go through it again. Go through, down, okay. And then I'm going to draw a line there as well, so I know that this connects to that. Okay. Let's go ahead and draw that one. Perfect. Okay, now let's go ahead and get started, and let's mark it down. Okay, so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to start with verse 30. The apostle gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. So in order to do this, and we said again, in viewing everything in light of context, we know that John the Baptist was beheaded right before this. So one note I'm going to make, because I'm sure that's exactly what the disciples and apostles reported to him, is I'm going to write Jesus heard the news of the death of John the Baptist. Now we know that John and Jesus were cousins because their mothers were related. So this probably was really personal to Jesus. I'm sure he had a hard time hearing this news. So this is probably why, if you continue down to verse 31, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So here Jesus is, and he's having a really hard family situation going on right now with the death of John the Baptist, one of his beloved friends. So we know that one of the reasons he's going away is in order to be by himself. So let's go ahead, we're going to use a different one. I'm going to highlight verse 30 and parts of 31. So go over, let's highlight that. Okay, done and taught, and I'm going to do come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest a while. Then I'm going to highlight this one again. We're going to highlight it blue, give a different color so we know it's going to connect to the highlighted passage. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and underline this so I know it goes with this. Okay. I'm going to draw my line again. This way I can track everything that's going on. Okay. Go ahead and draw my line. And I'm going to do the color on that as well. For many people, we're going to continue back on the second part of verse 31. For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So we know that Jesus' ministry is continuing, even though it's just kind of getting started. They just had the commissioning of the 12 and the beheading of John the Baptist. But already there's crowds of people who are following him. So we're going to go ahead and make a note that people were hearing, that word of Jesus was spreading. So I'm going to write the word of who Jesus was and his ministry was spreading. So Jesus is becoming quite popular at this time. So we're going to go ahead and box that off, and then we'll continue with the next section. Now we're going to go ahead and just draw a line to box that section off, and we're going to connect it to the end of verse 31 where it says, for many people were coming and going. So now that's kind of talking about the ministry of Jesus and his popularity. So let's go ahead and highlight that. We're going to do our line, highlight the line again. There you go. And then make sure to draw your line. Let's go down. Verse 32 says, "So then they went away in a boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them and ran on foot to the towns ahead of them. And when he went ashore," meaning Jesus, "he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things." So we're going to write that as we see this, that Jesus is having compassion on the crowd. Not only is he coming out of a time when he had been sad, but now he's just continuing to minister to the people. So we're going to write on here that Jesus had compassion on the crowd, and he was comfortable with crowds and wanted to provide for the people. So let's go ahead and write, Jesus had compassion on the crowd, and he was comfortable with large crowds. With the crowds, and he wanted to provide for their spiritual need. But he also provided for their physical needs. So I'm going to write that down. I'm going to write spiritually and physically. And then we're going to go ahead and connect that. This is just the beginning of his ministry. So as we're seeing this, not only does he have compassion on people, but he loves that they're coming to him and that they're seeking out his advice and counsel. This is going to go ahead and connect with verse 34. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight verse 34. Now Jesus relates us to the shepherd needing a sheep, and the sheep needing a shepherd, and how Jesus is our shepherd, just like he was for the people there. Jesus is our shepherd. So we're going to go ahead and connect this one. And I didn't do my other line, so I'm going to go ahead and do that as well. Mark that it goes there. And then I'm going to draw the line from here. I like to kind of circle my text or underline it. That way I know. So with this one, I'm just going to go ahead and underline. And then I'm going to draw the pink here. Perfect. Okay, now let's continue going down the passage. We're going to go to verse 35, which says, "When it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, 'The place is deserted and it's already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' And then we're going to go to verse 37. "You give them something to eat." He, meaning Jesus, responded. They said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" Okay, so first thing we're going to notice is that it's getting late. So what they're going to do is that the disciples are now going to be providing for the food. So we're going to write on here that the disciples were responsible for providing for the crowd. Perfect. Okay, now Jesus could have totally provided for the crowd, no problem. But part of the reason I think that Jesus called the disciples to do this is he wanted to test their faith. He wanted to see if they're going to be feeding 5,000 people. This is going to be a miracle that they're witnessing firsthand. So he wants to see what kind of faith do they have and what are they going to do when things come up and it's not easy. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight this part where it says, "You give them something to eat." This is a command from Jesus that he's telling the disciples, look, the people are following and we need to take care of them. Let's go ahead and draw our line again. I'm gonna move my Bible up just a little bit so you can see. Okay. Do our highlight. Okay. Perfect. Now, another thing that we want to notice in this is that how much was 200 denarii? Now, at the bottom of my Bible, it says that a denarius was worth 1 day's wage. So 200 denarii, and that's just for bread, would have been worth about 200 days' wages. So I'm going to mark a note on that because that's a lot of money. That would be, for you, almost a full year's salary is going to feed these people. So we're going to put 200 denarii is equal to 200 days wage. Okay. This would be another thing that if you don't have at the bottom of your Bible, you could use a commentary and this would give you the amount. You can also look it up, but this will be helpful as far as what they're thinking and how they're thinking that this is going to happen. I'm going to use the orange one and I'm going to highlight the 200 denarii worth of bread. So pretty much what the disciples are saying essentially in this is that it's impossible. How are they going to feed all these people because they don't have that kind of money? But this is where we get to see the disciples in action and see where is their faith and how, even though that they're following Jesus and part of the miracle, they're not necessarily trusting that Jesus is going to be able to provide for the people. You would think by this time, after having experienced all the different miracles that they have, that they would trust Jesus a little bit more. But that's not typically the case. Okay, let's go ahead. We're going to go down a little bit more and we're going to go to verse 38. And it says, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Okay, so we know that Jesus already provided someone that was going to have all of the food provided. So I'm just going to make a little note that God totally provided for them. Even though it's just the beginning, we're going to continue to see how he provided. So let's continue going down. We're going to go down and keep reading. And verse 40 says, so they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He, meaning Jesus, took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. Okay, let's start right there. So first of all is his posture during prayer. Jesus takes what he has. He takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he looks up to heaven. So I'm going to write that the posture of prayer that Jesus had when food, it was a posture of humility, knowing that if he asked the Lord would totally help him. So I'm going to go ahead and write that. Notice the posture Jesus had when he prayed over the loaves and the fish. And then I'm kind of going to make just another little additional note saying that he looked up to heaven. So he's already assuming that the Lord's going to hear him as he's praying. So he's looking to heaven, waiting for waiting for God to answer him. So I'm just going to write, he looked up to heaven. Looked up to heaven. I think this is something that is so impactful because this is how we need to have when we're coming before the Lord in prayer, that we need to understand that while Jesus can answer our prayers and while God can answer them, what is our heart and what's our posture and what's the meaning behind it? Are we doing it for selfish motives or are we doing it to help and feed his people? And I think with this we can totally see that his motives are not selfish at all and that they're purely for ministry. Let's go ahead. I haven't used purple yet, so I'm going to use purple. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and circle his posture. It says, looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke up the loaves. I'm going to circle this portion. And then I'm going to draw my line again. Come down. Okay, let's go ahead and highlight this. Okay, and then in the next portion, we're going to see how Jesus is answered, his prayer is answered, as we know the loaves of the fish. Now, we know the story and what happens, but I think it's so awesome that the disciples were having to see this firsthand, not knowing what the Lord was going to do. So as we're reading it, we're able to already know, well, of course he's going to heal the people by giving them food. So what we want to do is we want to look at this in the eyes of the disciples and the faith that they needed to have, not knowing what the Lord was going to do. Okay, now the next part we're going to do is we're going to keep going. And it's at the end of verse 41. It says, he kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. And then we're going to go to verse 42 where it says, everyone was ate and was satisfied. So not only was there enough, but everyone ate and had their fill. So I'm going to write on here that not only was everyone fed, but they were satisfied. So not only did the Lord provide for the people, but we're going to see that they ate until they were satisfied. So I'm going to go ahead and circle this portion right here. And then we're going to, again, draw our connecting down here. I'm going to try to kind of keep this down a little bit. Box it off. So God provided over and above for their need. He didn't just provide enough. He even provided enough so there was leftovers. Let's go ahead. I'm going to use green. Actually, I'm going to use blue. Go ahead and use blue. I'm going to highlight this portion right here. And then we're going to go ahead and box off our text as well. Move it up a little bit so you can see. Perfect. Okay, let's go ahead and finish. They picked up the 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. Now another part in Matthew mentions that this was just 5,000 men and it didn't include the number of women and children. So I'm going to make a note of that there are probably more than 5,000, but the Gospel of Mark only includes the counting of the men. So what I'm going to write is that only the men were counted, not women and children. So now we know, like, not only were there 5,000, there was an additional one. So there had to at least probably been, I would assume, around 5,000 women if every one of the men was married. And if not, think of all the children. So there was so many more than just the 5,000 that were being fed. So only men were the ones counted. A little hyphen, not women and children. Okay, we're 5,000 men. Again, I'm going to circle this portion and I'm going to draw my line going all the way down. Okay. I'm going to use orange on this one as I continue to highlight. I'm going to go down a little bit more so you can see there are 5,000 men. And then we're going to do our connecting. So go down. Okay. There's a couple little more things I want to add, even though we finished the portion of that. I want to add that not only was there more than enough, like we talked about, but they were satisfied. But I want to talk about how even in this portion, the people left everything to follow Jesus. So it wasn't like they just left their homes or that they just left for the day. They literally left everything and they followed Jesus. So I'm going to write down below. I'll just write down here. The people left everything in order to follow and hear from Jesus. And it's so challenging because I think how often are we willing to give up everything to follow Jesus. And it's not even the same stuff that they were giving up, but how often are we willing to put ourselves aside in order to hear from the Lord, in order to spend time with Him? Are we willing to get up early? Are we willing to make plans around spending time with Him every day? It's so convicting because not only were they following Him, but they were coming and coming the more and more that they heard about Jesus. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just make that note at the bottom. I'm not going to really connect it to anything simply because it's a little far up top. So I'm just going to mark it here and we'll just close it off. And then one last thing before I finish, this is what it looks like so you can see it. I'll bring it up a little bit better so you can see it. But I really want to encourage you, as you're reading through it, use other sources, use commentaries. You can make a lot of observations yourself. A lot of these ones I made by myself without using commentaries. But one thing that's super helpful and I want you to do is when you're reading this, again, make sure you read it in context and then break down the verse. But before you use anything else, read the passage a few times and make some of your own notes. It's amazing what the Lord will show you as you're going through your own time. But if you're relying solely on other sources, you can't always hear from the Lord because you're so focused on the others. So I want you just to look at other verses and other passages. And if you don't know, again, they have them at the bottom. It'll give you a little bit more. And I'm using She Reads Truth Bible to make my notes. It's the CSB, so the Christian Standard Bible version. But any journaling Bible works. I also have done a previous video where I used a non-journaling Bible. But this one gives me a lot more room to write notes. So again, before I leave, I want to remind you, remember context, break it down, and then make sure to read it on your own first.